We are taking a look at all the latest NHL trade talk from around the league, talking about teams like the Flyers, the Blue Jackets, the Predators, the Bruins, the Carolina Hurricanes, the Islanders, and more. We'll jump into all the latest coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a lot of teams I want to take a look at today and take a look at some of the rumblings of moves they might be making here. But obviously at this point, we're kind of a bit of a standstill. Free agency is really slowed down and the trade market has kind of got clogged up as well. I know there's all kinds of talk about teams who want to make moves and are still kind of looking to finalize moves for their roster for next year. But we've kind of hit a standstill with activity in that regard. A lot of it, I think, has to do with obviously the flat cap, and obviously the teams just don't have the space, and they're having a hard time shedding salary to be able to make the moves that they want to make heading into next year, which is making things incredibly challenging. As we talked about yesterday, there's still a fair bit of decent free agents out there. Some even that are pretty solid NHL scorers and had a long history in the league, like Mike Hoffman is a prime example of that. So we will see if any of these deals come to fruition here, but there's all kinds of still rumored activity here that teams would like to try to do sometime soon. Kick things off with the Philadelphia Flyers. There's a recent article from NB Sports Philadelphia talking about the possibility of them still trading defenseman Shane Gostisbehere, especially after signing free agent defenseman Erik Gustafsson, who is a very offensively minded defenseman, very similar type of player than Gostisbehere. Gustafsson is not known for his solid defensive play in his own end, but more of a power play specialist, an offensive kind of guy. He's only signed to a one-year deal, but still there was already talk about Gostisbehere's future with the team, with a lot of the other defensemen really kind of moving their way up the rankings ahead of him here. Obviously, you have Provorov as your top defenseman there. He's the most untouchable player on the back end for sure. You got Sanheim, you've got Myers, you've got Robert Hagg just got signed a new contract. A lot of these guys have kind of worked their way up past Gostisbehere. You throw Gustafsson in the mix, and it kind of makes him a little bit redundant. I mean, in the playoffs, there was even times, even though he played better, he still was getting to be a healthy scratch at times. So there's certainly a lot of talk and consideration that Gostisbehere could still very well find himself on the move. The one thing that makes this move more manageable than a lot of other potential contracts that are talked about being in the rumor mill right now is the fact that it's actually not that bad. I mean, if he can play the way he did a couple of years ago and be a 50 to 60 point defenseman, at over $4.5 million is actually a really solid contract. So maybe a fresh start is exactly what he needs. I mean, we know last year he battled some injuries, which obviously impacted his mobility. Looked better in the playoffs, but still, this seems like he's completely fallen out of favor there. And especially with the addition of Gustafsson, I would be quite surprised to find out that the Flyers aren't really still pushing a trade for Gostisbehere. Just a matter of where does he go is the big question. There was a lot of moves already made between trades and free agency, and like I said, there's lots of interest. Just a matter of teams finding the way to do it so that they create the necessary amount of salary cap space. But Shane Gostisbehere is certainly still a player that I would look for to be traded here in this extended offseason before we get to next year. We don't know when exactly next year is going to be, so they could have an extended period of time to kind of get things figured out. When it comes to the New York Islanders, another Metropolitan Division team here, they have a lot of tough decisions coming up as well. And they have some key restricted free agents they need to sign eventually, like Matt Barzal and Ryan Pulock. These are two players who do not have arbitration rights, so there's no rush to get these deals done. Now, some of the RFAs we know around the league that have a little bit more experience have arbitration rights, and we know we're going to have contracts settled here sometime in the near future. But in the case of the Islanders, like I mentioned about Tampa as well, they're in a unique situation, kind of like what we saw with the Maple Leafs go through the last couple of years with guys like Nylander and Marner, is that because there's no arbitration rights, they could take their good old time, which means that they're not going to go over the cap, which means they're not going to be forced to make trades. I mean, at the same time, they're going to possibly be without their RFA players if they don't get new contracts. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that regard. Now, with the Islanders, what the rumored moves that are being talked about is to really believe that they kind of have handshake agreements in place with Matt Martin and Andy Green, as well as Corey Schneider coming to the organization to be a third goaltender. Obviously, he would end up getting buried in the minors likely because they're more than likely going with Varlamov and Sorokin to start the season. So the Schneider contract could even be a two-way deal as well, and that wouldn't necessarily impact their cap situation. But a Martin and Green deal, which would be relatively cheap, certainly would have a minor impact as well. Now, of course, it's also rumored they still want to have a third-line player that they need to sign, and they're even considering still maybe a return from Derek Brassard. but they also have some other options out there that can consider in free agency, like a Carl Soderberg would be a good option. He's got a very experienced third line center. You could also look to guys like Andreas Athanasiou, as well as even potentially an Eric Howland. Now, some of those players they're all in kind of different spots in their careers, might demand different amounts of money, but with the free agents that are left, I don't think any of them are getting overly expensive contracts. So no matter how you shake it, they have options there. But even to mix in a few of these cheaper veteran contracts is still going to prove to be pretty challenging. So obviously there's a lot of talk about Johnny Boychuk going out the door. I know probably about a week ago we were led to believe, based on rumors, that they were really close to making a deal to trade Boychuk, and I do believe there was a lot of legs to those rumors. I think there was a lot of truth to it. It just never came to be. What exactly the holdup was, we don't really know, but we know that there's still conversations going on. He's still the prime target to be moved, which will clear up $6 million of space, which would be a huge help to the Islanders. I mean, obviously, you look around, there's only probably 2 or 3 or 4 teams who could handle that kind of contract. You're looking at Detroit, Ottawa, maybe New Jersey. New Jersey wouldn't be all that far from the Islanders, so from a personal perspective, it might be a decent move for Boychuk, but obviously, if that $6 million can come off the books, that's going to be a tremendous lift to them. And there's also talk as well, they're considering moving a player like Leo Komarov, who's also been on the block, but he's got 2 more years left at $3 million, and it's maybe difficult to find a taker for Uncle Leo's contract now. But if they can find that, that is another player they're considering moving on from. Now, another big possibility here, which we don't know how it's going to go, is the health of Andrew Ladd. If Andrew Ladd can go on long-term injury reserve, if he's unfit to play, that's another big cap relief. So if they can even move one player like Boychuk, get Ladd on LTIR, that solves a lot of issues, and they can get a lot of these other contracts solved and get everybody kind of in line here. I would think Barzal more than likely very well could end up taking a short-term bridge deal. He probably would have preferred that long-term deal. Many thought before, like way back before the season was in its early stages, that he probably was going to be demanding $9 to $10 million on a 7 or 8 year contract. But given the market and the landscape and how things have changed since the 1920 season first got underway, I would likely think that's pretty unlikely at this point. But the Islanders are a team who need to make moves, and they're kind of in a standstill, almost in stuck mode, as they try to find the additional space so they can get Barzal and Pulock signed and start to move on here with their offseason. But there's been a lot of quietness out of New York, and it's just a matter of time before they get some answers here. But they're finding a taker for Boychuk and completing that deal is still really high on their priority list and paramount to getting the rest of their stuff accomplished here. I also come across a few articles talking about moves we might see out of Buffalo, and one move could still possibly mean moving a defenseman. They still have a lot of D on the team, and even though they're under contract now, a guy like Brendan Montour or Rasmus Ristolainen, I know Ristolainen's been talked about a lot in the last couple of years, and we're led to believe he's not going anywhere, and that could still be the case. I personally think it might make more sense to trade Montour at this point, but either way, one of them to go, because they're still in a situation where there's many believe that the Pagulas do not want to be a cap team. I mean, if you think about it, the Sabres, like many teams that are trying to work their way up, they probably shouldn't be a cap team at this point. And based on the fact that they haven't really made the playoffs or won in a while, so there's that. And secondly, with everything going on, they don't want to be a cap team because it's just really too difficult on the finances right now. There was a lot of speculation in Buffalo before that they wanted to have an internal budget that was much lower than the cap, maybe even in the low 70s, like probably upwards of 8 to 10 million below the cap. So at this point, I'm thinking that might have changed their minds a little bit on what they're willing to spend. Obviously, giving Taylor Hall $8 million has a major impact. But if you look at their team right now, they do have a fair bit of cap space, but they still have to sign Sam Reinhart. They still need to sign Victor Olofsson, as well as Casey Middlestat and goaltender Linus Ulmer. So that's going to eat up a lot of their available space. And to have that extra flexibility, as well as to not be too tight to the cap and kind of meet their internal budget needs, it makes sense of moving a defenseman, especially Montour. To me, he's got a 1-year contract. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent next year. We know he didn't really fit the greatest with their system under Ralph Kruger. To me, it makes sense to move him on so he can get a fresh start, and they should be able to get a decent return. Now, they had to pay a first-round pick to get Brandon Montour, so I don't see them getting that back after a bit of a down season, and especially where the market is right now. But if they can get even a second or third round pick plus a prospect or some kind of combination that's obviously going to be less, I think they take that deal, because to me, Montour is a good defenseman, just needs to get into a right situation where he can thrive again like he did with the Anaheim Ducks, and he'll be much better off putting up much better offensive numbers like we saw in the past, and I don't see him staying in Buffalo beyond the current season. So I think that made a lot of sense why they did a 1-year deal, but they could be walking him to losing him for nothing, which I don't see them doing as well. So just because he was signed, I still think he's a prime target to be traded to free up some space, cut them a little bit of a break in the finances, and get something in return for him now from a team who can have him for a whole year. It only makes more sense. So I certainly see a scenario unfolding where the Sabres trade a defenseman, with Brandon Montour being the most likely target. Now, there's several teams still looking to add some top 6 firepower. You can add the Carolina Hurricanes to that mix. The one thing that they're different, though, compared to some of these teams, is that they're looking to do it more so through the trade market, because they'd like to be able to, get some space before money comes in. So what their preference would be to trade Jake Gardiner along with a goaltender, preferably James Reimer. Now, of course, they need to have a goaltender coming back, ideally, or they go with Alex Nedeljkovic. Now, if they go with Mrazek, and if they keep him in the organization, Nedeljkovic as a backup, I think he's earned an opportunity at the very least. But I think if they were to trade Mrazek, they can't go with Reimer and Nedeljkovic. That, to me, would be too risky. But at this point, we talked about the Reimer contract, that obviously is very little actual cash left owing on it. It's 1-year deal left. Makes sense that it would be an easier deal to find. But we saw a lot of goaltenders in the goaltending free agent carousel, as well as a few trades that we saw early on kind of land on their destinations. And there's not a ton of openings left at this point, but there are still a few teams kind of sorting out, a few minor spots. But it's not going to be an easy deal to do. But the Hurricanes would prefer to trade a combination of Gardiner and Reimer for some scoring help at the forward position. Ideally, a top 6. I'm not convinced that's going to get you a top 6. I think Gardiner, based on how he played with the Leafs, might have gotten you that a couple of years ago, but he didn't have a great year in Carolina. Reimer didn't have a great year either. You're not going to be able to combine those two things for a top 6 forward, but you're going to have to throw in an additional piece, whether it be a good-looking prospect or a pick. I know on the blue line, besides Jake Gardiner, another player who desperately needs an opportunity, and they either need to trade him or give him a chance next year, is Jake Bean, one of the top American Hockey League defensemen. Worked really hard over the last few years. Been quite a few years now since he's been drafted, and needs an opportunity. So maybe they'd consider including him. I'm not sure, but either way, the Hurricanes are looking for a top 6 forward, and that is what they would prefer to move out to make it happen, which is going to be an incredibly challenging accomplishment for them. So we'll see if there's any takers on these players that the Canes are looking to move. Now, you can also throw in the Boston Bruins into the mix as well. Somebody who's looking to add, to forward group and on the blue line. And the blue line, they have more questions than answers right now. They lost Troy Krug. It's really unclear and seeming more and more likely, I guess, that the real possibility does exist that Scherer may not come back either. So that really hurts the blue line. They got Grzelcyk signed, which is a good start. They have to add some more experience and veteran back there in the blue line, which they should be able to do through free agency. There's enough available players out there, but there is still some talk about adding at the forward group, especially where there's a pretty good opportunity. May not start the season with Pasternak or Marchand in the lineup. And there's a lot of talk about Jake DeBrusk and his future, because he needs a new deal as well. And they may not be comfortable paying what he's going to be looking for on a contract. So we could still see some activity within the Bruins organization through a trade. I mean, if they decide to move DeBrusk, that could very well bring back another defenseman. So that could be a solution to that. And they could also possibly get a forward as well, maybe a younger forward. It kind of would depend, of course, on the deal. But Jake DeBrusk's name is still certainly out there. Not really sure exactly what his future holds. I'm going to say it is a scenario that could be where he gets signed and stays, and it could very well be that he is moved. But the Bruins are another team out there looking for help at both positions. With the Boston Bruins as well, one blue line that they were apparently linked to was Florida defenseman Mackenzie Weegar. Now, we've heard in the last week or two that there's been a numerous amount of teams that have shown interest in Weegar's services, and he very well could be a guy that the Bruins come back to. I mean, there's still a lot of people that believe the Panthers are very much open to trading him, so we will see here how that goes. But Boston would be a team that would make sense for them to look into that, since they do have some question marks now on their blue line, and there are some free agent options out there, but not nearly as many as there was before. And he's also a different type of defenseman that I'm really not sure at this point you're really going to find on the free agent market. So could we see Weegar go to Boston? I would say it's a definite possibility. And then you can throw in the Predators and the Blue Jackets, two teams that we saw made a lot of moves at the heading into free agency here after the draft and around the draft, clearing some cap space. They both were getting ready for something bigger, is what it appeared. I think both teams were in on Taylor Hall, both teams to a degree, maybe not the full extent that we saw at Vegas. Would have liked to have been on Alex Pietrangelo, but clearly he didn't talk to a whole lot of teams because I think the intent was once he knew St. Louis wasn't an option, it was pretty much Vegas got it done. There wasn't a whole lot of chatting going on with other organizations to the best of my knowledge, but they were really trying to position themselves to be in a position for a big move, and that did not work out. So therefore, now they're kind of looking for plan B and what to do. So they both need help at scoring, and they could certainly, do that via trade or through free agency. They have multiple of options here, especially in the case of Columbus, who seemed willing to trade one of their goaltenders, whether it be Korpisalo or Merzlikins. They've both been on the market. They do have some other forwards that they need to decide their futures as well. So adding a top scorer in there, especially if they can get a solid winger to replace what they lost in Josh Anderson, that would be good. I mean, they brought back Max Domi, who's expected to be their number 2 center behind Pierre-Luc Dubois. So you throw in what else they have in the mix there, and they could use another scoring winger. Would really complement things extremely well. And if you're Nashville, you already struggled to score last year. You moved out Kyle Turris, which overall wasn't an overly a bad thing, because it didn't just another deal that just didn't work out. And then you also moved out Nick Bonino, so now your depth at center is a little bit not as deep as it was before. And you did that in order to find some scoring wingers, but you haven't done that yet. You lost Craig Smith in free agency, which I think they were okay with. Granlund, who they had last year, is still out there. He could maybe circle back and return. Who knows? But there's not a ton of options anymore. I know there's rumor that they talked to Mike Hoffman and Anthony Duclair, and that one of them could very well be a fit there. But the Preds are a team like Columbus. They need to make decisions here soon. You either scoop up somebody in free agency they think they're going to go with, or try to find a trade, because there's just not a lot of options that are going to be left here soon. We already saw the trade market kind of get locked up, and it's only going to get worse here as time goes on deeper into the offseason, as more money and roster spots get committed to by other teams. Now, of course, we know as well the Vancouver Canucks certainly are another team looking to clear some cap space. We had a couple of signings here today, which made things a little bit tighter again, and they're still looking for help as a top 6 forward, ideally looking to replace what they lost in Tyler Toffoli. They really need to find a way and decide how they're going to proceed here to create some cap space. Like we talked about in the last few days, moving Louis Eriksson is going to be pretty much impossible. I think the best case scenario for Eriksson is that he goes to the minors, gets buried, which gives them about $1 million in cap space. Obviously, like I said, a buyout's too expensive at this point, and a trade just seems really unlikely. If they're going to buy anybody out, it would likely be Brandon Sutter, and a lot of that's probably going to depend on how the Jake Virtanen contract works out. They very well could still swing a deal here where they maybe move out a couple of pieces to find some space and bring back a scoring forward. Again, that's not going to be any easy task. Things are really clogged up right now, but again, look for the Canucks to be active here, especially once we know the outcome of Virtanen's contract. So that is all your news for today. Of course, as always, I want to know what your thoughts and opinions on what we will see these teams do. A lot more questions than answers right now, as free agency in the trade market is kind of clogged up while we wait for something to break and give us some more movement here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.